Todd, so I appreciate you getting in touch with us. And again, we're here from the High School for Math Science and Engineering all the way in New York City, broadcasting
Yep.
live and direct and worldwide to you. Todd, we just finished reading the book. It's a wonderful work, extremely in depth. Why
Thank you.
was this the right time to write about Drazen?
That's a good question, Nick. It's funny. Obviously, a lot of people know about Drazen from the documentary, um, which came out in October of 2010. Um, that wasn't the reason I wrote the book. I'd been interested in Drazen a long time. As an Australian who played college basketball in America, I was always aware of the Europeans that had come to America, say the 15 years prior to that, and had been successful. When I was in college, the two teams that were most fun to watch were Dallas and Sacramento, and they had a lot of Europeans. So I watched those a lot while I was in college. Was aware of Drazen, didn't really know his story, but when I was doing some journalism work down in Oklahoma City, I used to live in Kansas, but was talking with a scout one day, and he was telling me about Drazen, telling me about how good Drazen was shooting off screens, like just some random comment. And I began researching Drazen, began emailing some people in Croatia because I was very interested about his story.
Hmm.
Later on, the documentary came out, and that only had more questions. There was a Croatian writer who was preparing a book on Drazen, so we initially started as a collaboration, but he pulled out only a couple of months into the process. And there I was. And so 3 years later, here's the book. But to answer your question, no one had ever written with great depth about Drazen, and there was so many unanswered questions about his life. Obviously, because he died young, there's a fascinating element to it,
Hmm.
rightly or wrongly. But there's plenty that happened when he was alive that also, he only lived in America for 4 years. So to write a book about a European for an American market was a little bit risky, but the first 24 years of his life were very interesting. So hopefully that reflects in the book.
Yes, to us who got a chance to watch him play here in the United States, our exposure really was when he hit it with New Jersey and growing up here in New
Yeah,
York
absolutely.
City. Had a chance to watch him every night on, geez, I can't even, it was like Sports Channel, I think, here in New York. And they used to
Yeah, that's
broadcast the
right.
Nets game and not really come in such high definition, but the announcers were in love with Drazen, and we got to see him
Yep.
through there. And we knew he was from, Croatia, and he played with the national team, but his story really does start well before his entry into the
Yeah.
NBA.
Yeah, he was a professional at 15. And not only that, by 18, he was the best player in Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was a massive republic, country, made up of the six republics, obviously, and, a vast area. Yugoslavia was an international basketball power. So by 18 years old, he was the best guard in almost in Europe, you could say,
Right, and they didn't
at
they,
least.
they didn't play that up too much here in the States, even when he was here.
No, it wasn't until 1986 that his name started appearing in American media. And he was, what, 23, 22 by
Hmm.
then? But he was drafted by Portland in 86, and then he was sort of, in the peripheral a little bit. But Europeans were not, as they are thought of as today, as I'm sure you know, like they're well respected now.
Right.
Back then, there was something about proving, and like I said, when Drazen got to New Jersey, it was about proving, proving himself and proving that Europeans could be
You
successful.
discussed the 1986 draft, and you open up the book discussing how him and Sabonis kind of played off of each other and had that rivalry, and they were drafted right at the
Yep.
same time with Portland. How's that important to the whole story?
It's important because they were the two best players in Europe, and the Americans were trying to determine how good the Europeans were, and so Sabonis and Drazen were the measuring stick. Now, because Sabonis was a big guy, he was more guaranteed as a proposition. Drazen was not. So there, I like to play off the contrast there in the opinions held towards them by, say, the Blazers when they were scouting them. But it's important because it's the first step. Europeans had been
Hmm.
drafted before, but as far as making attempts to bring them to America, That wasn't really happening in the mid 80s. It wasn't really happening at all.
Right. The
So
only one I could think of is like Oscar
both
Schmidt, who was drafted in '84, and even then, I don't think there was a serious move to get him over here.
No, he there wasn't, and I know he did maybe some summer league. He was drafted by the Nets, I believe, and it wasn't really a thing that was serious. But at the same time, those guys were vital parts of their respective national teams. And if you were a professional, you couldn't play in the You couldn't represent the national team at the Olympics. The contradiction to that was Detlef Schrempf,
Right.
who was German. He attended high school in America, went to college in America, and this strange thing happened as I was researching and speaking to people. Schrempf was not held in the same regard as, say, Sabonis or Drazen. He was thought of as a product of the
Right.
American system. So he was exempt. And that's sort of the foundation of the book, Nick. I wanted to understand why the Europeans were thought of in a certain way and then how Drazen sought to change that. I found that like a really fascinating thing. And apparently it was a very big motivator in his life. So that was an element I wasn't expecting going in, but as you would have seen in the opening parts of the book, it was a very sort of um, strong sort of
Right. You make
theme
that
in the
very
book.
clear that Drazen just brought this kind of new flavor and new ideas about what the world would think of the guards from that part of the world. Um, maybe they thought of as
Yep.
being a step slow or not quick enough to handle or strong enough to handle the rigors of the NBA, but Drazen really was a pioneer in that sense, and in that he broke the mold on such a global scale.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Nick. And the thing that I was trying to understand about Drazen was like there were other Europeans who were really, really good players, like Vladi, obviously, and Sarunas Marciulionis. Those guys were not thinking about becoming superstars in the NBA. They were just thinking about coming to the NBA and being good players. But Drazen had this mindset that he wanted to be a star. And I spoke to his brother about it. I spoke to his friends and his mother, and like, why was Drazen? Why did he think that way about his career and life? I'm not sure that I accurately answered it because nobody was able to give like a definitive answer as to why. But it was just something that I think that's why he was who he was, is because of his unique mindset and approach, and that separated him from
Oh,
the other
sure. You paint
European
this
players at the
tremendous
time.
drive that Petrovic had from such a young age, um, that coupled
Thank you.
with the skill that he was able to develop made him such a strong force. In talking to his many friends, teammates, family members, what could you imagine about a young Petrovic, shooting his way, in the gym, by himself as a little kid? I was trying to get that
Yeah.
visual as I was reading the book.
You know, when I decided to write the book, Nick, my approach was I'm going to speak to every relevant person in his life. Obviously, Drazen's not with us anymore, so to get the best idea of the sort of person he was, I needed to speak to the people who knew him best. So I made every effort I could to speak to those people. You know, you're right. His drive, and I had this vision in my mind of where he grew up. I was able to access some videotapes that highlighted Šibenik, which is the town he grew up in. There was a documentary made about Drazen that showed his childhood home and where he played basketball for the first time. So I tried to capture those elements. And really, his brother, who was a very good player as well, his older brother Alexander, who also played for the Yugoslav national team. Actually, he was the guy that sort of planted the seed in Drazen about being a basketball player, and sports was like an escape, a way to be successful. And um, Drazen didn't need much prodding to sort of have this inspiration to be a basketball player. He was a very determined person, but I think it carried over to other areas of his life. I remember one of his coaches told me that when he was 18 years old, he would drive his coach's car, around the town to get practice. So as soon as he turned 18 years of age and was legal to drive, he'd be ready to get his license. The way he thought about life was very interesting and
Sure. And
obviously a high level of motivation. So it
how
was important to capture that in
forthcoming
the book.
were his family members about this, and how much cooperation did you get from him? Because you said earlier that a Croatian had helped start with the book, and you had taken on the bulk of the project after they had backed out. How cooperative were they with you?
Yep. Initially, the Croatian writer that I was collaborating with, which only was a couple of months, it wasn't a great period of time. He was like, they're not going to speak to us. Let's speak to everyone else. And then obviously he pulled out after a very short period of time for personal reasons. But um, I spent about 18 months researching and researching and interviewing. And then there was a story by one of his former teammates, a man named Zoran Chitra, who's now a journalist in Zagreb in Croatia. He wrote a story about how an Australian was writing a book about Drazen. Well, the Petrovic Museum, which is run by the family, were made aware of the story, which was in a magazine, and then they contacted me and they wanted to know about the book. They were curious. All I did was send them a list of every person that I'd interviewed, and once they saw that, friends and his teammates and his agent and people that he was close with, people who Drazen trusted and loved, and they were welcomed me with open arms. His mother wrote me two separate letters. His mother doesn't speak English, but she wrote two separate letters that were translated, both of them 8 to 10 pages. One was about his childhood, and the other was about how they dealt with life after he was killed, and it was just unbelievable. So I also interviewed his brother Alexander. I didn't speak to Drazen's father. He suffered a fairly major stroke a couple of years ago. But they've been supportive of the book 100%, and I guess they appreciate that I'm trying to relay, what Drazen was about, and they're all about pushing his legacy and making sure he's in people's minds. So I think they appreciated the fact, but they're also working with me to get a Croatian translation done. So
Yeah,
I'm
that would
hoping
be
to
wonderful
launch that
because
in
I'm sure
Zagreb
he's
later in the
an
year.
icon, to say the least, over there. And sometimes when taking on these
Much.
tasks, some family members are hesitant because they're concerned of people trying to write a smear piece or trying to find out really what happened when he died. But this book is so deep that that's really such a small part of the story is the end. I mean, he had a whole life before that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the kind words, Nick. I do appreciate that. But yeah, absolutely he did. And I interviewed a couple of people who made a point of saying to me, don't focus on his death, um, focus on what he achieved, and that was not a problem for me. So yeah, there's a part about the accident there. If I was going to write if I was going to write a detailed book about Drazen, I needed to cover his death and the accident, etc. But yeah, there was so much to his life that was very interesting, and you know what? It is a legacy that he has left. So hopefully that's something that is apparent in the book. And I think that's one of the reasons why his family was so open and welcoming
Sure, and you said
towards the
that
book, is because of the
it
message
took
that it was
you a year
relaying.
and a half to get a lot of the interviews done and the research. Our class wanted to know what the most difficult task for you was in writing this book.
Uh, it was about putting together the right information about the first part of his life, which was, say, the first 20 years, which was in Yugoslavia. So because that country is broken up now, a lot of the information, it was very hard to find. Like, there's no newspaper archives, there's no outlets where you can just readily find information. Not like, say, in America or even here in Australia, where the public records are easy to access and coherent and things like that. So piecing together the early parts of his life was very difficult. But if you speak to people, they can provide you information, and then you sort of follow the leads, so to speak. Um, yeah, and look, I had to make sure it was detailed in order for it to be the book that I wanted to write. When people would speak about Drazen, they'd tell stories. So I wanted it to be a book full of stories. But researching was tough. But like I said, if you're going to do a book, you want to do it correctly, and hopefully that comes off as
Right,
well
and
researched.
they were
But
also interested just in the
yeah, the early part
process.
of
So
his
after
life
you
was very
got the
challenging.
ideas together and you got your research, how long did it take for you to put it from, all right, I've gathered all the information I feel that I need to actually making it a published product?
Yeah, as I was doing that, and I've never written a book. I I don't know what the right process is or what the wrong one is, but I did a chapter outlines. Um, Initially, the book was not chronological. I made it in a way that it's very hard to explain, but I was sort of doing a bit of jumping around using the 4 years in the NBA as like the foundation of the book, and then jumping back to his childhood and then rise up to stardom as the story goes along. But I decided to then do it chronological from start to finish. But the chapter outlines took about 6 months, and I could, like I said, I've never written a book. I wasn't a publisher had not. I was trying to get a publisher to invest in the book, which couldn't happen. So that's why I self-published. But so I did basically. I had one editor, a friend of mine who is an author who helped along with the process. But yeah, the chapter outlines took about 6 months, and yeah, ended up being a big
That's incredible
process.
that this is
But
a
when you
self-published
hold
book. I'm
that book in your
surprised
hands
that
at the end,
in the
it's very
United
much
States
worth
that there
it.
wasn't someone that was willing to jump on it because I think he's still, Drazen has a story that hasn't been fully told. I mean, this is going to be the book, on his career. How do you feel about that, knowing that probably you have written the book on his career?
Oh, yeah, look, it's a great feeling. It's funny you say that, Nick. I thought the same thing. I thought, a publisher is Drazen has a unbelievable story. You could almost make a movie out of Drazen's life. It was so interesting. But I was told by a literary agent. He said to me, this is after I wrote the book and was looking for a publisher. He said, a book about a European will not sell in the American market. And I was thinking, oh gosh, that's terrible. And my wife said to me, she said, they said the same thing about Europeans playing in the NBA, you know. But now that the book's out, it's funny. I've had an offer from a publisher to republish the book. So who knows? We may get there at some stage. But look, I'm very proud of what I've done. Obviously, it was a lot of work, and if I was going to put all this work into it, I wanted to make sure I did it right. And
You
I don't
spoke as you
think you
played
could probably
college
write a more
basketball
detailed
here.
book. So
Where would
hopefully,
you
I've
play
done my
for?
job. Yeah, well, it's when I was 16, I was playing. Well, I was practicing with a semi-professional team here in Australia, and I had an American teammate who suggested that I go to America and play a year of high school basketball to get the exposure and maybe get a scholarship. So my senior year of high school, which was 2002, I lived in a place called Fowler, Colorado, very, very small town. But I had a good season, and I got a scholarship to a junior college in Colorado. And then 2 years after that, I transferred to a school called Central Christian College, which is in Kansas. It's an NAIA school. It's a pretty small school, but I was an all-conference player 2 years in college, and I wasn't a great player, but I was an okay player. And yeah, there's some highlights on YouTube. Actually, someone made a
How do you feel that
mixtape, so
helped
you'll have to check it out. It
you
makes me
write
look
the
a
book,
lot better
having
than
that
what I really
basketball
was, Nick.
background?
Yeah, it meant everything. It meant everything. Basketball is my life. Obviously, I moved across the other side of the world to play, and then I later coached for 2 years as an assistant coach, and it did. It helped me understand, you know, hey, sometimes you just got to take a chance, and it worked for me. And opened a lot of doors. I made a lot of contacts that helped with the book, but also, Drazen was a guy who had a dream and he followed it.
Both
So,
merged, huh?
in a strange way, I also had a dream to write a book, and it wasn't guaranteed. So I
Yeah,
sort of
sure.
forced
And
my way in. But
how were you able to follow the NBA
good
living in
things happen, I
Australia? I
suppose, if you
mean,
put the work in.
you know, was it readily accessible to you, or did you look more towards the Australian pro leagues?
I had no interest in the local professional league. It was 100% NBA. My brother and I lived and breathed. They used to show one edited game a week on Saturday mornings. It was for 1 hour. And then they'd show a program called NBA Action. And we used to live for that. So every Saturday morning. And then when I moved to America, I was able to watch it every day. And, I live it and breathe it. But right now I have League Pass, the broadband, and yeah, watch games in the morning. You can watch them on replay. But I think in Australia, League Pass is, or outside of America, Australia has the highest League Pass
Right.
subscribers. So
Because yeah,
basketball is
my
very
memories go
popular
so
here.
best. Is like
The local
Shane
leagues are
Heal,
really
maybe does
struggling,
that keep
but
right? He
NBA
was
is
like
very
one of the
popular.
earlier guys that was here, and then there was a few others in the states here. But I remember him being as
Yeah, absolutely.
the early
Yeah,
'90s playing.
yeah.
Yes.
There was actually a guy, Andrew Gaze. He played at Seton Hall. Uh, yeah, so he's one of our popular. Obviously, we've got a few now in the
Did you have
NBA,
any
Bogut
plans
and Patty
if
Mills
the
and
things work out with the
Dante Exum.
publishing and
There's
you
a few
manage to
good
get it
players
published in
coming
the United
through.
States that you would try to come here and possibly promote the book?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Obviously, Nick, there's a limitation to what I can do promotional wise, being basically a one man. You've got to do everything, which is a bit frustrating, a bit tough. So if the opportunity, I'm actually speaking with the publisher tomorrow. So if they make a good offer, I'd be silly not to take it, I think. So yeah, promotion would be huge. And yeah, I would
Right.
love to come to America and obviously the New York area, New Jersey area where there's a lot of Croatians and Drazen's fondly remembered.
Hey, that's
That would
been like the
be that
central
would be a
theme of
good
this talk.
situation. But yeah,
It's how a dream is coming
it's
to
nice to
fruition,
dream, I
whether it's this
suppose, but
book
we'll see how we go.
or Drazen's career. What was your reaction when Drazen passed personally?
Absolutely. Yeah, actually, it's funny you ask. My dad, when I told my father that I was writing the book, he remembered the same thing that I remembered. He actually told me that Drazen had been killed, and we were interested in the NBA at the time. I was only 9 years old, and we knew who Drazen was, and just remember the shock. And yeah, it was like the accident was like a cloud that sort of hung over the whole book. Everything you write, everything that he experienced, even when I was learning about the successes he had, it was like, gosh, how bad was it that he was killed? But look, it's a part of his story, it's a part of his legacy, and yeah, I'm not sure. There's still some people I feel, Nick, that haven't got over it, and you can understand that. Obviously, his parents would be one, but other people like friends
Were you able to
and
get a hold of
family,
any of his
when you speak to them, you can tell
American
that
teammates
that cut is
in the
pretty deep
process
still.
of writing the book? And if so, who was like the most cooperative?
Yeah, I did. I spoke to a couple, but the guy that I think of is Chris Dudley, who was one of Drazen's closest friends with the Nets, and he was able to tell me about Drazen, sort of some deeper things about Drazen. About how he would talk about the situation in Yugoslavia when he was with New Jersey. Um, but at the same time, Drazen, whether it was because he was European or whether it was because he was a bit of a loner by nature, uh, he didn't really fit in as well with his American teammates as perhaps he could have. But he was very close with a lot of the coaches, and I found that the coaches were able to give me a deeper insight into his personality than any of the teammates that I spoke with were, which I thought was interesting. But
Play basketball,
Drazen was sort of a guy with a pretty
right?
narrow
NBA players
focus,
have
and
like so many more distractions,
everything sort of
especially
got
once they
put to
grow
the
up here.
back.
The game's over. They're on
Exactly,
to
that
whatever
was
the
his
next thing
life.
is for that night, that evening, or where to go. And I don't. It doesn't seem like he was as caught up.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good observation, and I agree. I think he was very much focused on. He had an idea in his mind. He wanted to spend a certain amount of years in America.
You talk
He
about
wanted
him
to
like
get a
wanting to
certain
accomplish
thing,
stuff
certain amount of
in
things
America
done,
here and
and
within
then
that
that was
time
it. That was
span,
the
and
culmination of his
coinciding
life.
with when
So
he passed, a lot of things were up in the air. Whether he was going to stay, return, sign overseas again, um, and I think that just adds to the story.
yeah,
There was a lot of unfinished business around the time of his passing.
yeah, and it's funny you bring that up because when I researched, within a couple of months, I sort of found out that that was happening, and I was not aware that he was willing to thinking about leaving, and then I went on this crusade where I was just determined to find the answer. And it turns out Drazen hadn't made a decision when he was killed. But you're exactly right. Because he was killed, it sort of adds to the mystery. His agent, a man named Warren Ligari, was still trying to sell the idea that Drazen was going to go back to Europe. But in my mind, um, I don't think he would have. I think he was too competitive and he was too driven. You know, his whole life was to get to the NBA. And yes, he did prove himself. But Drazen still, you know, his life went like this. He wasn't going to go back to this. You know, Europe couldn't offer the same competition. I just think somehow the contract thing gets worked out, and I think he stays.
Right.
But I also was told if he was an unrestricted free agent, he would have signed elsewhere. So because he was restricted, it's obviously a chance that New Jersey would have been in the ideal position to say match any offer from another team, and
And what
so
was
he probably
equally
would have
sad
stayed in
was
New
after
Jersey,
he
and he probably,
passed,
yeah,
the Nets like
you can
crumbled
only
pretty
imagine
quickly.
what other things he would have accomplished given his
They fell
personality.
apart, got rid of key players, and
Shocking, isn't it? Shocking. Yep. And that sort of started with Chuck Daly leaving. Interviewed Brendan Suhr, who was an assistant with the Nets, and he was a Daly guy. He followed Daly from Detroit. He said that Chuck wanted to resign based on Drazen's death. It shook him up pretty bad. He stayed an extra year, but after that he left, and then Coleman and Anderson sort of went downhill. And yeah, even the Croatian national team, a similar thing happened where they never placed better than third at another tournament. You know, by the mid '90s, they were no longer an
I was looking
international
through some
power as they
archives
were
and I
with
found this, I
Drazen.
can get this
So
card up here.
his death
This is a card of
really,
Drazen
you know,
Petrovic,
shook a lot of things up.
oh, but that's the face. That's what I remember. You know what I mean? Like I think about Drazen, and he let his
Oh,
emotions out
beautiful.
on the court. You know, when he
Very
played,
nice.
and 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 again, you illustrate that, and that's also illustrated a lot in the
Yep.
documentary the ESPN did, that he wasn't shy about hiding his emotions, you
Yep.
know, on the court. And he wasn't scared. Jordan or whomever it was, Reggie Miller, didn't matter who he was going up against. Dumars.
Yep. And that was the thing, Nick, that stood out to me most about Drazen was this overwhelming emotion in both directions, whether he was happy or upset about something. He just, you know, on the court, he was just, you know, you knew more about Drazen than any other player on the court because of the way that he expressed himself. But that's why I chose the photo that I used for the cover. You know, the big smile, and that's what I think of, like you, when you think about him celebrating. You know, I think
Yeah,
about
he
that
was just
emotion
really
as well, and I think a
incredible
lot of
with the
people
jersey
associate it
there,
with
and
Drazen.
I
So
feel
that's why the
fortunate to have a
photo that I
chance to
chose for
watch
the
them
cover, I
most,
think,
you know, every night
was an
here on
appropriate one.
television, as also, you know, as a young teen, you know, during that time, and just really seeing the Nets get it, the announcers, all Rafferty and
Yeah,
Ross, they were in love with him. They used to love saying his name, Draws. You know, they really were in love with him, and you know, for a kind of a small, even though they're in a big market in New York City, they were still like, you know, definitely the second
yeah,
bananas hitter to the Knicks. But to watch him every night just nail shots at like tough angles and coming off his screens, he made the Nets interesting to watch. And you know, I mean, having Coleman and Anderson definitely helped, but Petrovic took over
yeah,
often.
yeah. And you know, isn't it funny? He was only there 2.5 years, and what is it, 23 years, 22 years later, people still remember it. It's fascinating. And I was told that there was an employee of the Nets who's been with them since 1967, their first year in the ABA. He told me Drazen was the most popular player in the history of the Nets because of the way that he, and you know, talking about the emotion, Drazen made people feel involved. You know, you still remember watching him on television, you know, 20 odd
Sure.
years
I mean, I
later.
was
Like
excited when I
that's
saw
an
that the
overwhelming
book
sort
was
of
coming
sense of
out, and you
involvement
know,
from
my
an
kids are really
athlete
interested
to a
in
fan.
the
You know,
story
it's
after we
pretty
watched some
incredible.
video and some highlights, and you know, we've split up the book as a class, and we're each reading parts of it to, you know, digest it and come together to see what the story's like and how you went about it.
Yeah,
And you know, I think it's a they've learned, and you know, it'll be a chance for another generation to pick up on him instead of us who got to watch him play. But now to just get the whole story. I think it's excellent that you were able to capture that, and I wish it a successful journey. I noticed you're on Twitter. How have you found the social media experience with helping to promote the book at this
Yeah.
time? And for the people that are
Well,
watching,
thank
what
you.
is your Twitter handle so they know? Okay.
It's Todd Spehr 35. The spelling is a little bit tricky. That's TODDSPEHR 35. But yeah, social media, it's a bit hard work sometimes. I'm not a big self promotion guy, but I think it's probably necessary to make sure that people understand that the book's available and out there, and just getting it in people's conscience is the hard part, the difficult part. But yeah, look,
Yeah,
I
no, they
appreciate the
definitely
kind
did. I look
words,
forward
and
to seeing the
hopefully,
review. It's too bad
I've
we're
painted the
literally worlds
complete
apart.
picture of Drazen
You know,
and
this
what he was
this
about.
doesn't
So
line
I
up, and
hope the
we don't
guys
want to
enjoyed
see
it
you
in the
at your
class.
your finest at about 4 a.m. You know what I mean? When we have class. How can people pick up the book
Yeah,
if they want to buy it? You did say it's a self-published effort, but how can they pick it up?
of course. Yeah, it's available on Amazon, Nick. You can get it the paperback. You can get the Kindle version. I know it being a thick book, the shipping is a little bit costly, so the Kindle's available as well. But you can also buy it through the publisher who is CreateSpace. They also sell it direct as well. But yeah, obviously I'm biased, but I think it's a pretty good
Well, we
story.
congratulate you on
It's
the
more about
effort.
Drazen's life.
Definitely an
It's less
award winner. I
about the
hope you
way
get
I wrote it.
readers
So I think
coming to
Drazen's
you, and
life's
as a class,
very
we look
interesting, and I
forward to
hope,
giving
yeah,
it,
I hope everyone
a
enjoys it.
full review in the coming week or so. All right, all right, thanks a lot, mate. Best to you. Take care. All right.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.